Hello, welcome to a continued series on second language learning. As we know, the curriculum is more than a series of subjects put together for the school day. It is also an ideological statement that suggests how the community and society at large values the student. For the second language learner, the issue is critical because there are several other factors to consider to create a successful school experience. This evening, we hope to explore some of the important issues in second language learning. Our moderator, Ms. Michelle Afonso, has a BA in psychology from Fairfield University and a master's in elementary education from Sacred Heart University. Ms. Afonso is presently working as a bilingual teacher in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I hope you enjoy the program. Ms. Afonso.
Thank you, Dr. Simoes, and welcome. Tonight we will examine the historical factors underlying the development of the curriculum which drives language instruction in our nation's schools. In face of No Child Left Behind legislation that is at the crux of language instruction, we will take a look at the specific aspects of legislation as they apply to second language acquisition. We will analyze the current national standards and objectives for second language acquisition and how these influence what and how your child is being taught in your neighborhood school and how they are assessed. We will hear from scholars and practitioners in the field of child development, anthropology, world languages, and teaching English as a second language. At the conclusion of our discourse, we will have established the current framework for second language learning, and we will be in a position to determine the possible future of second language instruction in our country. Sue Layton-Smith is a teacher in the Stanford Public Schools. She holds a master's degree in English and Education from Cornell University and a law degree from the University of Chicago Law School. This evening, Ms. Layton will develop for us the historical legal underpinnings of second language instruction in our schools and analyze the current mandates of the No Child Left Behind legislation. Ms. Smith?
Designing programs for students with limited English proficiency is a pressing issue for educators today. These children are the fastest growing segment of the school population. Their numbers have increased almost 95% between 1990 and 2000, with the total school-age population increasing only 12%. Like the immigrants before them, they deserve a chance to achieving the American dream of success through the gateway of education. The American dream is elusive if they lack English skills needed to succeed in the mainstream classroom. Tonight, I am discussing how federal legislation and U.S. Supreme Court cases impact programs for these students. First, with a discussion of the legal history before No Child Left Behind, and second, with a brief look at Title III of No Child Left Behind, the most important federal legislation today for English language learners. What programs exist for these English language learners today? Typically, public schools in the United States follow two models with many variations. The first is the bilingual and the second, English as a second language, ESL or TESOL. The bilingual programs deliver content instruction through both English and the student's native language, while the student is developing English proficiency. English as a second language programs, TESOL, ESL, provide content instruction and language skills through instruction with English. Most program models contain elements of both, use of the child's native language and English. Our new legislation, No Child Left Behind at Title III, permits use of a child's native language in instruction and the use of English. Tonight, I'm going to refer to both of these programs as bilingual. Let's start with a quick tour of the highlights of bilingual education in the United States. Prior to the arrival of the Europeans, the 16th and 17th century, the continent was populated with hundreds of indigenous Native American tribes, a huge diversity of languages and cultures. The tradition of multilinguistic and multicultural society continues today into the 21st century in this continent. In the very earliest colonial days, education took place in the home, small local schools. Education laws were mandating reading, but they were silent about language choice. The majority of immigrants before the U.S. Revolution in '76 spoke English, but other languages and cultures played a very important part in commerce, social, religious, and political life. Politicians had a tolerant view of language use, something not evident today. Official documents were translated into many languages. In early New York, under Dutch rule, for example, as many as 18 different languages were spoken on the streets of what is now Wall Street, including Native American languages. That's not so different from New York of today, or Los Angeles, or Chicago. Indeed, at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, following the American Revolution from England, anti-British sentiment was so strong that our founding fathers in Philadelphia almost selected German as a national language for documents. The story goes that German lost by only 1 vote, and the United States Constitution was drafted without any provision declaring English or any other language to be a national language. This is in sharp contrast to many other nations around the world today. All attempts to mandate a national language, whether by John Adams in 1780, were rejected by Congress, or by Noah Webster with the Supreme Court ruling on that case in 1831. We still do not have a national language. Although English is a majority language, over 400 tongues and different languages are spoken around the United States today. Let's move from colonial times to the 19th century. Formal bilingual public, private schools existed well before the 20th century, particularly in areas not occupied by the early colonialists. The new immigrants settled out west in new communities and brought their languages and customs with them, educating their children at home and in community schools. In 1839 in Ohio, we have the first state to adopt a bilingual education law, permitting German and English instruction. Going down south to Louisiana, we find French and English approved in 1847, Spanish and English, not surprisingly, in the Southwest. For example, the New Mexico territory laws passed in 1850 allowed Spanish and English in the schools. A dozen other states passed similar laws by the end of the 19th century, and informal bilingual programs, neither mandated nor prohibited by state law, sprang up to serve the local needs of immigrants speaking Norwegian, Italian, Polish, Swedish, Danish, Czech, let alone the Native American languages of Cherokee, Navajo, Hopi, among many others. What happened? The story of state legislation in the 19th century is not all rosy, despite the 14th Amendment being drafted immediately after the Civil War. In the 19th century in the U.S., we started to see restrictive policies developing against native languages. For example, some people say they were due to prejudice and racism and other types of fear. Native American children were taken off reservations and put in boarding schools where they were forbidden to use their native language and taught English only, a military strategy to advance settlement of the West. Children of slaves were forbidden any formal education in state-owning slaves due to fears of escape. And this was well documented in Mark Twain's famous book, Huckleberry Finn, the story of a white boy and a black escaped slave in their travels up and down the Mississippi. Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin and Frederick Douglass also wrote about the terrible situation in education of slaves in the 19th century. This had a major effect on abolition. However, what happened after the Civil War is children of slaves may have been free, but they were put in separate facilities, segregated away from their peers. This practice was not outlawed until Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. Some northern states also restricted education of children in color in the 19th century in the infamous Black Laws. California, 1884, Chinese children were forbidden to attend public schools, and these were immigrants' children who'd been brought to the state to work on the railroad. These injustices continued, it's sad to say, in pockets around the country, supported by local law well into the 20th century. Also in the beginning of the 20th century, we find new immigrants coming in from non-English speaking countries, new economic, social, and military concerns. And the U.S. began to move away from the laissez-faire attitude regarding multiculturalism. Legal controversy over language use developed. Nebraska went so far as to prohibit teaching foreign language in elementary schools. A law declared unconstitutional on the basis of the 14th Amendment, and Meyer versus Nebraska, 1923. A fear of the enemy, speaking in a different tongue, was starting to spread, and particularly a well-known situation after World War II is demonstrated in the removal of Japanese population in California to concentration camps in the desert. During this part of the 20th century, bilingual education decreased, new immigrants were thrown into public schools in a sink-or-swim fashion, and the two world wars increased the public mood for unity and common experience. This retrenchment on multiple language use did not really change until an enormous social upheaval, the civil rights movement, occurred in the middle of the 20th century. These dramatic changes in the national scene led to the dawn of the civil rights era, with President Johnson, a Democrat from Texas, launching the War on Domestic Poverty and the Great Society. The struggles by African Americans and other minorities resulted in sweeping legislation promoting equal opportunity in education. And the historic Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, was enacted in 1954. More than just court cases occurred. We had major federal legislation in the mid-1960s with the Civil Rights Act, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of national origin, race, and a few others in federally funded programs. This was followed by the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of '64, aimed at improving educational opportunity for disadvantaged children. Following 4 years of that act, after the plight of Mexican immigrant children was well documented nationwide, a new title was added to that act called Title VII, the Bilingual Act of 1968. The Bilingual Act was reenacted about 6 times before it was repealed a few years ago in 2002. The Bilingual Act was rolled into No Child Left Behind, along with provisions for immigrant and migrant children. The one act we cannot ignore is the Equal Education Opportunity Act of '74, which turned the U.S. Supreme Court holding in Lau versus Nichols into legislation applying to all schools, whether or not federally funded. This Equal Education Opportunity Act mandated that schools take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that interfered with equal participation of language learners in the classroom. Another Supreme Court case in the same era, Flyler versus Doe, provided that children of immigrants in Arizona would be permitted free public education, despite the fact that their parents may be from different countries. This 1982 case had a major impact around the country because now all children, documented or undocumented, were permitted to be in the public schools. What school districts can do today is only ask for proof of residency within the school district, not proof of citizenship under this Supreme Court case. Schools are forbidden to ask questions that might expose the illegal status of the family, and contact between the schools and the immigrants is strictly forbidden. Schools in Arizona and around the country after this case in the 1980s could no longer solve the so-called problem of language learners by excluding them from schools entirely. The most important Supreme Court case was Lau versus Nichols. In San Francisco, about 1,800 Chinese students, a portion of the total 3,000 of Chinese ancestry, did not speak English and received no supplemental courses in English language from the schools. The court ruled this violated Section 601 of the Civil Rights Act of '64, which prohibited discrimination on national origin. The court noted that a significantly large number of the Chinese students were being totally immersed, sink or swim, into English classes where they had no understanding of the textbooks, no understanding of instruction. The court stated in famous dicta that, quote, "There is no equality of treatment by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. If students do not understand the English, they are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. Basic English skills," the court went on, "are at the core of what public schools teach. Imposition of a requirement that before a child can effectively participate in a program, he must already have acquired basic skills of English makes a mockery of public education. The Lau Court directed the local school board, here San Francisco, to use its expertise to remove language barriers for the Chinese students if the schools were receiving federal funds, and San Francisco received a healthy portion. It did not mandate any particular model of service, and the Supreme Court did not require bilingual education, a point clarified by subsequent federal cases within the California jurisdiction. Federal guidelines, advisory, not mandatory, did provide a roadmap, however, after the Lau case, to help superintendents learn how to establish programs in their districts that were effective. The Lau remedies had an enormous effect on state educational policy. State laws addressing language barriers, that's the key word, mushroomed. Schools in violation of the Civil Rights Act who had 20 or more of the same language group needed, under the guidelines, to submit a voluntary compliance plan with the Office of Civil Rights if they were violating Section 601. These provisions caused superintendents around the country to jump on the bandwagon and establish programs directed at removing language barriers for ELLs. The guidelines were discontinued by President Reagan in the 80s, but the bilingual programs were not. The legacy of the Lau's decision and the Lau remedies is still seen today in high-quality bilingual and ESL classrooms around the nation, and also in state laws. When we look at those state laws today, we see a majority of states have bilingual laws, and they also certify bilingual teachers, a direct legacy of the civil rights era of the 60s. In 1999, 43 states plus the District of Columbia had laws establishing bilingual programs. Only 7 did not. Alabama, Hawaii, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Mexico, Tennessee, and West Virginia. And about 48% of those states offer certification and endorsement for teachers of bilingual and ESL, a critical national shortage. In Connecticut, we can see how these state laws work if we look at the General Statutes, Chapter 164, Title 10, Section 17. This establishes in Connecticut English as the medium of instruction in our state. However, exceptions are at 10-17A and 10-17F for pupils who, by reason of birth, ancestry, or otherwise, experience difficulty in reading and understanding English. Section 1017A provides that any Board of Education shall, that's a requirement, establish a bilingual and bicultural program of study involving a culture in which a language other than English is predominantly spoken. Just so the purpose of that program is to help children become proficient in English. The duties of the boards of education around the state are set forth at 1017F, and they include establishing these programs where 20 or more eligible students are classified as dominant in more than one language other than English, but for no more than 30 months. Parents are given a choice whether or not to enroll their child in a bilingual program or to select other options, including English immersion. After 30 months in Connecticut, services may be provided, including but not limited to ESL, shelter English, English immersion, tutoring, and homework assistance. This is all set out specifically in the state law. The State Board of Education in Connecticut went one step further to show the state's strong support for bilingual education and multilingualistic approaches. In a position statement in 2001, the board stated that it's very important in our state for all children to try and have a second language, and that the state of Connecticut values its multicultural heritage. Now, this trend that we see in 43 states and we just talked about in Connecticut is countered by a new trend in 3 states, a very recent trend. California in '98, Arizona in 2000, and Massachusetts in 2002 all passed programs limiting bilingual education and limiting the use of native language of a child in the classroom. In the aggregate, these 3 new state laws pertain to more than 40% of the limited English language speakers in the U.S. Whether these new laws help students learn English more quickly is yet to be conclusively established. The extent of the new provisions limiting native language, to the extent to which those are followed, is also another question that is open for examination and will take some time to see. This is particularly true in schools where most of the children speak a language, perhaps Spanish or Chinese. An important question for the future is, will other states follow the lead of California, Arizona, and Massachusetts and retreat from bilingual programs? Colorado recently rejected such a plan overwhelmingly. No Child Left Behind in Title III, which we will discuss next, moves in a different direction from the Bilingual Act. Having traveled through time, let's now look at No Child Left Behind at Title III, called the English Language Acquisition, Language Enhancement and Academic Achievement Act. Quite a mouthful for some new legislation. This is the 21st century grandchild of the civil rights laws. Although officially repealing the Bilingual Act, in reality the Bilingual Act here is reborn in a new form, the English Language Acquisition Act. Title III passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support and no objections from the Hispanic Congressional Caucus. It provides transparency into the classroom of the language learner. Administrators need to demonstrate that ELLs in their classroom are improving English and mastering academic standards. Data collection includes a new subcategory, the group of students with limited English proficiency. These students may show up in more than one category, to the dismay of certain administrations where things are not going well in the classroom. This includes the race category and the category of economic disadvantage. The spotlight increases scrutiny at all levels on the ELL's progress and hopefully more attention to effective program design in the future. Title III differs from the Bilingual Act in many ways, and we're going to look at 6 of those very quickly right now. The first is name. I mentioned that already. We have a Bilingual Act under a new name, the English Language Acquisition Act. The reason that name is important is because it shows up in many places. No Child Left Behind removes the word bilingual entirely from Title III. Perhaps this is because the word bilingual has become increasingly controversial and taken on political connotations associated with immigration far beyond its educational application. This name change extends to federal organizations responsible for services. The Bilingual Office in Washington is now renamed the Office of English Language Acquisition, and the National Clearinghouse of Bilingual Education has become the National Clearinghouse of English Language Acquisition. States or schools, school districts are also starting to change names of their programs and removing the word bilingual and referring to references of English language acquisition. A second difference between this act and the old Bilingual Act of '68 is the goal. It's now quick acquisition of English, with the benchmark being the number of students reaching proficiency and academic state standards at the end of each year. Developing a student's native language, the cherished goal of legislation, particularly in the '94 version of the Bilingual Act, was explicitly deleted. However, what was retained is teachers may use a child's native language in instruction if it helps develop English skills. Attempts to go one step further and mandate English only in the classroom were rejected in committee. The next difference is in the emphasis on scientific research for programs. This is extremely important for program curriculum design. What we see here is over 100 references in No Child Left Behind to the word scientific research. The open issue here, and one likely to cause academic debate, is what is scientific research? Great benefits flow from instruction in English, plus a native language, according to Jim Cummings and other researchers in the field. This just makes common sense. A child builds on prior knowledge, vocabulary, and concepts already acquired in the first language and transfers them to English. Scientific research shows that students who can function in more than one language develop more advanced cognitive skills and outperform their classmates on those high-stakes standardized tests. Scientific research that continues to develop in that area will be important for curriculum design. The fourth difference is assessment. It is now annual and must be linked to state standards. The fifth area of difference is parent notification and choice. Within 30 days of the beginning of the school year, parents need to be notified about a child's assessment as limited in English. The reasons for that assessment, the methods of instruction to be used, how this method will help the child learn English and meet standards, the rate of transition into English that's expected, and the graduation date that's expected. Parents must be informed of their right to remove the child from the program and to enroll the child in an alternative program. Notification needs to be in a language that parents can understand. Parents may remove a child from one school and transfer the child to another school if there's a failure to make annual yearly progress on those state standardized tests. To understand the parents' new rights, the Federal Office of English Language Acquisition recently issued a Bill of Rights pamphlet for parents. The next area of difference that's significant is how money flows from the federal government to the states. In previous years, blocks went on a competitive basis to entities that could show and put together programs that were competitive. Today what happens is the dollars are following the children. The more children who are language learners in a state, the more money that will go to that state, plus a bonus if a state is new to the issues of massive immigration. The headcount system provides about $149 per child. So when you think about massive federal dollars going into the program, $149 has a limited impact in many ways. Certain states will receive more, such as Texas and Arizona. Other states, particularly mountain states with Native American programs, will receive less. What has not changed is who's eligible for these services. Students born in other countries, speaking another language, plus those born in the U.S. who lack proficiency in English at home can be included in these programs. This includes students who speak Navajo, Hopi, Eskimo, and Hawaiian. It also includes immigrant students who may speak English, being born or being aged 3 to 21, born outside a U.S. state, and who have attended U.S. schools for less than 3 full years. In conclusion, we have seen tonight that federal law has a major impact on the design of curriculum for limited English proficient students. Prior to the 20th century, there was very little federal involvement in education. Following the civil rights movement in the 60s, a 180-degree change occurred. The federal government entered in a major, huge way the arena of program design. This trend continues today with No Child Left Behind. The irony is that the federal programs now reflect the agenda of political groups seeking to roll back many of the gains made by civil rights activists. Local control is the name and reliance on scientific research. This is a trend likely to continue under the administration of President Bush. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Ms. Smith, for reviewing the highlights of language learning in our schools. You called upon us to reflect on our own feelings on the meaning of a fair educational opportunity and to ask ourselves if in fact this equal opportunity is being offered to all students. Thank you also for addressing No Child Left Behind, as this legislation affects language learners. We will next direct our attention to Dr. Thomas Zubek. He is the chair of the World Languages Department in King and Low Haywood Thomas School. Dr. Zubek holds a PhD in anthropology from Yale University and a master's in history from Brown University. He will contrast the national standards for teaching world languages with those of teaching English to students of other languages. Dr. Zubek will describe the assessment vehicles used in second language instruction and their correlation with curriculum. Dr. Zubek?
Thank you, Michelle. National standards for second language acquisition, instruction, and mastery, whether intended as guides for world languages, English as a second language, or bilingual programs, are neither reflective of the reality present in the nation's schools, nor are they intended to be restrictive, given the diverse school populations across the states. While separate standards have been created for world languages, the American Council for Teachers of Foreign Language, or ACTFL standards, English as a second language, the Center for Applied Languages standards, and for bilingual programs, the overlap among them in terms of skills given priority, content of instruction, and instructional goals is great. These national standards have been adopted either partially or wholly by states, school districts, parochial and private institutions, and often provide mission-like statements defining the desired outcomes of a given program. Yet, the standards are often criticized as deficient by instructors and educators actually responsible for achieving outcomes only vaguely defined in standards. Many standards on the state level fail to integrate a cultural component into language goals for instruction, but focus only on communication. Ample research has demonstrated that language is embedded in culture. These standards also fail to acknowledge diverse modes of expression. Similarly, standards do not always recognize the levels of mastery implicit in second language learning. Communication does not solely take place between individuals, but is also required when written, audio, and visual sources are presented. The audience of a given message also changes the manner in which one expresses oneself. All these factors need to be considered in forging language standards and outcomes. By far, the most detailed and specific of the standards published are those designed by ACTFL for the instruction of world languages. Not only are their overall standards designed to shape language instruction generally, but they also have been reworded into bridging statements and goals, which specify the means for the standard's implementation in the instruction of individual languages, Spanish, French, and so on. The depth and specificity of the ACTFL standards compared with those of ESL and bilingual is likely owing to the audience for whom they are designed, generally middle and upper class nationals learning a second language beyond English. The ACTFL standards are built around two key ideas, one dealing with modes of language usage and expression, and the other dealing with thematic goals for instruction and mastery. The framework of communicative modes informs the thematic goals. The framework recognizes three modes of expression: interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. Each of these modes is defined explicitly, given outcomes or paths for the demonstration of mastery, and cross-referenced cultural knowledge necessary to operate successfully within each mode. Ultimately, the final goal is knowledge of the entire linguistic system. The thematic framework of the ACTFL standards is built around the 5 C's: communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. While the communication standards are often mirrored in those produced for ESL and bilingual programs, the additional C's make for a much more powerful tool in the construction of curriculum. Cultures recognizes the need to understand the cultural practices and perspectives of speakers of the target language. Connections are made with other disciplines through the foreign language. In other words, content is taught in the target language. Comparisons are made not only between English and the target language, but also between the student's culture and that of the target language. And finally, communities are built as the students use the target language both within and outside of the school setting. ACTFL standards recognize the multiple points in the program of schooling in which a student may enter, and make suggestions for adopting goals accordingly, as well as providing for the conservation of students' native tongues through heritage learning programs. Compared to the ACTFL standards, the ESL and bilingual standards articulated by the Center for Applied Languages, states, and local districts pale. They tend to be concerned only with the communicative mode and make only passing reference to goals reflective of the cultural or community domains. Thus, they fail to live up to the goal of teaching students to know how, when, and why to say what to whom. These standards are also only vague and redundant and make no mention of the modes of language expression. For example, the ESL standards include Goal 1, Standard 1. Students will use English to participate in social interaction. And Goal 2, Standard 1. Students will use English to interact in the classroom. Both these standards appear to say the same thing, the latter simply specifying the use of the target language in the classroom, which one would expect anyway. Neither of these standards explore the modes of interaction possible, and neither give educators a clue as to how to accomplish these ends. A number of additional ESL standards are equally as nebulous. For example, Goal 1 Standard 3, students will use learning strategies to extend their communicative competence. And Goal 2 Standard 3, students will use appropriate strategies to construct and apply academic knowledge. What learning strategies are to be used is never defined, nor is the type of communicative competence sought or the type of academic knowledge to be applied. It is no wonder educators are often frustrated by these standards, which are often taken from the Center for Applied Languages and applied verbatim by states. At the district level, steps have been taken to clarify these types of standards so they can guide administrators and teachers effectively. Some school districts in Connecticut have adapted the standards, adding considerable numbers of bridging and clarifying statements to help them in order to help instructors understand how language is to be presented and ultimately the content that must be mastered. A number of cities in Connecticut have restructured the state standards in light of the populations of students with which they have to deal. Such districts have recognized the need to integrate cultural aspects into the teaching of English, just as is the case with world language instruction. Others have recognized the need to make connections to other disciplines, to teach content in the target language, and to find occasions for students to apply English in real-life situations outside of the school community. This discussion cannot help but lead to the recommendation that the rigor, depth, and clarity of standards for ESL and bilingual programs be brought up to the level of those for world languages. As has been made clear by many studies, when teachers expect more from students and articulate their goals clearly, students tend to achieve at a higher rate than otherwise. It is unfair to sell students short simply because they are English language learners. Similarly, a recognition that language is culturally embedded will help teachers shape curriculum so it is not only more accessible to ELLs, but also so it has more real-life applications. The path to more successful standards and better guides to curriculum construction at the state and district level must be one wherein the modes of language mastery, interpersonal, interpretive, and performance or presentational are recognized. The integration of world language standards into ESL and bilingual standards will result in a more helpful guided curriculum development for teachers and administrators alike. Given this discussion, a brief review of the English language learner models currently employed is in order, so as to highlight how many of these programs of instruction fail to acknowledge the value of students' knowledge of languages other than English, or the importance of students' cultural backgrounds. One can also appreciate how many of these models fail to fully integrate the three modes of expression: interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. The maintenance model. The goal of this program is to develop and maintain students' primary language and attain academic English proficiency. This program supports and encourages the use of two languages. Bilingualism and biliteracy are the goals in this model. The curriculum is taught in the first and second languages. Students are English language learners and are from the same language background. The home language is strengthened through strong language arts instruction. The home language is equally protected and developed. This model is considered an enrichment program. The concurrent translation program. In a concurrent translation program, the teacher shifts between languages to communicate an idea to the students. Concurrent translation programs are widespread. Researchers have discredited concurrent translation programs mainly because children often ignore the second language. SIOP, or the Sheltered Observation Protocol, is a research-based tool that has been used to measure a sheltered English program. Sheltered English is a common approach for teaching English language learners. In a sheltered English class, teachers use specific strategies to teach content areas in a way that is comprehensible to students while increasing their English language development. Although sheltered English is widely used, there is some question as to how effective sheltered English really is. The SIOP model is an explicit model of sheltered English. Areas of focus in a SIOP are preparation, instruction, comprehensible input, strategies, interaction, practice application, lesson delivery, review, and assessment. transitional bilingual education. The goal of this model is to develop academic proficiency in English and the student's first language. It prepares students to enter mainstream English classrooms within 2 or 3 years. Subject matter is taught in the home language until the student's proficiency in English has been sufficiently developed to allow them to participate successfully in an all-English classroom. Generally, less emphasis is placed on developing the student's first language, and more emphasis is placed on the first language as a bridge to English language development. Research shows that if the students learn concepts in their native language, the transition to English is much easier. The transitional model is primarily designed for limited English proficient students. Structured sheltered English is an instructional approach used to make academic instruction in English understandable to limited English proficient or LEP students. Students in these classes are sheltered in that they do not compete academically with native English speakers, since the class includes only limited English proficient students. This approach emphasizes the development of grade-level academic competencies. It is required that teachers be able to understand the child's first language. The children are permitted to use their first language to address the teacher, although the teacher will always respond in English. Teachers use physical activities, visual aids, and the environment to teach important new words for concept development in mathematics, history, science, and other subjects. There is typically no native language support or development. Submersion. Submersion is an approach to bilingual education in which English language learners are placed in classrooms where only English is used. No structured support for learning English is provided. The student's first language is never used, as the teacher most likely does not speak it. It is also called the sink or swim method. In the United States, this is a violation of the Supreme Court's Lau versus Nichols decision in 1974, and it is also seen as very unsuccessful. ESL is a model in which English language learners are placed in mainstream classes for most of the school day. They are usually pulled out for approximately 30 minutes in which they receive extra instruction in English. They are taught English skills using second language methodology. This extra help is based on special curriculum designed to teach English as a second language. The child's first language is rarely used in the ESL model. An ESL teacher is not required to speak or understand the child's first language, and therefore, if the first language is used, it is informal and non-instructional. This model seems to be inadequate for many English language learners. Immersion is an approach in which children are instructed exclusively in the student's first language for extended periods of time. English is not used until all students have a mastery of their first language. The theory behind this model is that if children become literate in their first language, they can then transfer these literacy skills to English. These children can also learn the core subjects, math, science, and social studies in their native language at grade level, so they won't fall behind. From this brief review, it is clear that some models acknowledge the value of students' first language and the means by which this knowledge can be used to facilitate English instruction. Some also note the importance of articulations between culture and language. Those models that integrate cultural understanding and acknowledge the different modes of communication, interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational, are likely to be more successful with English language learners. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zubek. Your discussion suggests that the National English as a Second Language standards and objectives which inspire the curricula in our school districts should borrow from the specificity and depth of ACTFL standards. This integration of the world languages standards into ESL and bilingual standards will better meet the unique needs of English language learners, offering clear and academically rigorous objectives using the interpersonal, interpretive, and performance modes of language mastery to drive curriculum construction at the state and district levels. We also appreciated your description of the various language learning models that educators may borrow from in designing specific programs that will best meet students' needs. Susan Hallahan is an educator and a consultant to the Family Resource Centers in New Haven. She holds a master's from Wesleyan University in Music and Urban Education and a master's in TESOL from Fairfield University. She will illustrate for us the challenges facing our nation's schools as the population of English language learners in our urban and industrial centers increases. Ms. Hallahan?
Language teaching and learning has been around for centuries. The models for teaching language have changed over the years, but their main purpose has remained the same, with improvements to the models. The Romans were the first to study foreign language formally. In the 16th century, practice versus learning the rules were being applied. Practice referring to memorizing grammatical points without understanding the reasons of the grammatical points. Learning the rules refers to a student's reasoning being pedagogical structures. An example is the understanding of the grammatical points. The student is aware of why a proper noun is capitalized. Today, we are also dealing with the question, should we teach practice or rules? Throughout the 17th to the 19th centuries, the emphasis turned to the grammatical translation method. This method dealt with learning grammar rules and vocabulary by rote, translations, and practice. This method resurfaced and became very fashionable during the 1980s and 1990s. Still today, some school districts are using a form of the grammar translation method. During the early 1900s, the direct method was commonly being used to teach language. The direct method was language teaching based on scientific knowledge about language. It began with speaking and expanding other skills. That words and sentences should be presented in context and that grammar translation should be avoided. The direct method focused greatly on speaking the language. In the 1950s and 1960s, the audiolingual method was commonly used to teach language. The audiolingual method focused on using drills and dialogue for formation of good language habits. This method dealt with the student being able to give quick and accurate speech response. This method is commonly used today in many classrooms. In the 1960s, Noam Chomsky challenged these models. We started using the transformational generative grammar model. This model identified rules that governed the relationship between the parts of a sentence, that each word had a fundamental structure exists. Today, this method is applied to the theory of phonological and semantic components of language. In the 1970s, the emphasis focused on the individualized instruction. The model was more considered with how the learner develops communicational skills and a humanistic approach to the language learner. As you will hear later in this presentation, we still use many of the key components that are in these models, but in a different technique. Schools develop academic curriculum to meet federal, state, and local guidelines, to prepare students for state and federal testing, and to prepare students for employment, meaningful citizenship, and participation in the American dream. Curriculum changes in school systems are often made to meet opportunities and challenges posed by local and statewide demographic factors. During the next 15 years, the United States will continue to experience significant population shifts towards the southeast, Florida, and the southwest, Arizona, California, and New Mexico, as an increasingly aging population seeks moderate climates. Older urban centers in the Northeast, such as New York, Boston, and Hartford, will continue to exhibit a decline in population, although several urban centers along the Northeast corridor are experiencing a reversal of the flight to the suburbs, which characterized the post-World War II years. Affluent empty nesters are returning to urban settings to live in luxury apartments and condos. As the population of cities and towns in Connecticut rise and fall, school populations are directly impacted, and the changing ethnicity of Connecticut's population is influencing curriculum development in urban and suburban school systems. What factors attract people to Connecticut's cities and towns? People come to Connecticut cities primarily for jobs. Connecticut provided significant employment in the insurance industry and also in the manufacture of munitions, submarines, and helicopters. African Americans from southern states came to work in Connecticut's factories and in industries supported by Long Island Sound's access to the Atlantic Ocean. In more recent years, immigrants have come for employment offered by the biotechnology industry, scientific research, and public construction projects. People have also come to Connecticut because they like living near universities, cultural attractions, restaurants, and shopping. They like our medical facilities and teaching hospitals. They like our urban parks, including extensive rail-to-trail walking paths and easily accessible public transportation. They like the University of Connecticut's basketball teams and other professional sporting events. Professionals have been attracted by Yale, Trinity College, Wesleyan University, Fairfield University, and many other institutions of higher learning that offer training in law, medicine, education, and business. People who live in Connecticut's suburbs and towns are there for access to houses with more land, a variety of shopping opportunities, good schools, and often for a more homogeneous population than they might find in urban areas. What aspects of current demographics affect curriculum development? The manufacturing jobs have largely disappeared, leaving a legacy of unemployment and poverty in Connecticut's urban areas. Several cities have experienced a decline in population over the past 50 years that is only now beginning to level off. Many members of the white middle class have moved to suburban areas, although some Connecticut cities have developed successful programs to attract middle and upper class suburbanites back to urban centers. Incentives have included new housing opportunities and a wide mixture of school choices. Hispanic and Asian immigrant populations are changing city demographics. The school system in one Connecticut city has just over 20,000 students who attend 49 different schools, including magnet and charter schools. The school population in this city is 55% African American, 31% Hispanic, and nearly 2% Asian. In another Connecticut city with 23,000 students, 43% are Hispanic, which is a majority of the school population. Curriculum developers are working to develop multicultural programs that will give all students a feeling of inclusion. We have heard about a variety of English language programs for students with limited English proficiency. Most of these programs help English language learners while allowing students to maintain and celebrate their first language and culture. There are about 140 languages spoken by children in Connecticut schools, but there are an insufficient number of trained bilingual teachers. However, mainstream teachers are now learning from their TESOL colleagues how to integrate ESL teaching methods and content instruction so that all children can achieve academically. While some children will become English proficient faster than others, curriculum developers need to make sure that the assessment tools they are using will regularly identify those English language learners who need extra help. Future demographic changes. How might they affect curriculum development? Connecticut's demographers predict that there will be a larger number of older residents and a fewer number of young children in the state. In addition, they predict that the percentage of Hispanics and Asians in the population will grow faster than other groups over the next 20 years. Connecticut schools will have more children who do not speak English at home and more children for whom English is not a first language. Even with 30 months of special instruction, many English language learners need language support to keep up with their grade-level peers. How should school superintendents deal with these demographic changes? Urban school superintendents should think carefully about the impact of magnet schools. Many of these schools have been academically successful, but at the same time, they have had persistent problems involving parents. Superintendents might want to consider returning to the neighborhood school concept. All superintendents will certainly need to plan for expanded English language services for parents and older residents. To do this, they will need to collaborate with social service agencies who can provide adequate childcare and public transportation for parents and other childcare providers. Children and adults learning English will need access to a variety of locations for English language learning, such as libraries and adult education centers. School superintendents will need to continue their focus on helping Hispanic and Asian children develop English language proficiency skills, reading, writing, and speaking. They will also need to plan for a growing variety of children with other native language backgrounds. School superintendents will need to find staff that can teach critical thinking, science, and geography, since these subjects will soon be added to CMT testing. Superintendents will need to encourage parents and teachers to provide opportunities for children to learn about their community and to develop prior knowledge. Superintendents will need to mandate English language learner training for mainstream teachers and to provide in-service training and staff development opportunities for mainstream and English language learner teachers who should be obligated to collaborate in curriculum planning, implementation, and evaluation. Connecticut's suburban areas will need to take a greater responsibility in making sure that adequate housing and educational services exist for a growing number of refugees and other residents who have not been born in the United States. Curriculum planners and teachers will need to continue to research and try out ways of including multicultural activities in the general academic program. And finally, demographers will need to share information with school systems on a regular basis so that they will be able to alert curriculum planners for changes that will continue to affect Connecticut schools. Thank you.
Ms. Holly-Ann, thank you for informing us of the critical demographics of which we as educators must be aware as we design curricula in the elementary, secondary, and adult education programs. As immigration to the United States continues to increase and the population in our urban centers grows, educators will be called upon to expand their English language services to families and the community. With the backdrop of No Child Left Behind, educators will design curricula and implement language learning models which will best meet the needs of their rising number of English language learners. John Schott is an educator in the New York schools. He holds a bachelor's degree in Russian from Boston College. This evening he will elaborate on the possible future of second language instruction as it is influenced by current legislation, research in the fields of second language acquisition, and socioeconomic demands. Mr. Schott?
At the present time, there are approximately 5.5 million limited English proficient students in United States public schools. It is a conservative estimate that this number will increase by 18%, or roughly 1 million students in the next 10 years. Of the close to 7 million limited English proficient students who will attend public schools in the year 2010, over 5 million, or 80%, will have Spanish as their native or home language. The remaining limited English proficient students, 1.5 million, will be comprised of a group that speaks individually over 100 different languages. The main non-Spanish languages spoken in the United States by limited English proficient students are Portuguese, Polish, Albanian, Serbo-Croatian, Chinese, both Mandarin and Cantonese, Haitian, Creole, Vietnamese, Urdu, the native language of Pakistan, and Japanese. The mandated testing in English and language arts by the No Child Left Behind Act will in all likelihood, make the transitional bilingual education classes obsolete. No longer will a student be taught in their home language for 2 or 3 years until they become proficient enough in English to enter the mainstream classroom. The transitional bilingual education gives a tremendous advantage to the Spanish-speaking limited English proficient student because the overwhelming majority of these classes are taught in Spanish and English. They would obviously be able to learn English faster because of the interaction with their Spanish-speaking instructor. The maintenance program and the structured or sheltered English approach will also most likely be discarded because they require the instructor to speak the student's home language. It is highly unlikely that instructors will be found that can proficiently speak the varied languages found in the English language learners classroom. If students were to be placed in classrooms where the instructor was proficient in their home language, would there be enough students to make up a class? It is economically not feasible to have a class devoted to 2 or 3 students. Will students then be placed in a classroom where a group of languages is spoken? For example, Slavic or Romance languages? Will there then be enough students to make a class economically feasible? Would this further confuse the student because the instructor still may not be fluent in the student's particular home language? The teaching method that most likely will be adopted in the future is a sheltered observation protocol in which all limited English proficient students are taught in the same manner regardless of their home language. A casualty of this process will be the limited English proficient students' ability to maintain their home culture while at school. When the student loses his or her culture, will they also lose their identity? Will the English language learner's classroom become a cultural melting pot? Should preference not be given to the Spanish-speaking, limited English proficient student because of their 4-to-1 majority over all other limited English proficient students? Is not the purpose of education to enable individuals to have success in their lives when they finish their schooling? According to the National Center for ESL Literacy Education in Washington, D.C., the newest area for ESL instruction, largely because of the North Atlantic Free Trade Association, NAFTA, will be the workplace. How will this affect an older generation of English language learners? Will this further contribute to children losing their native culture because parents will want to speak English with them at home? Will the percentage of Spanish-speaking, limited English proficient individuals mirror that of the public schools? And if that is true, will the programs in the workplace be more bilingual than multilingual? Will laws then be passed similar to the No Child Left Behind Act that will govern the curriculum in the English language learners classroom in the workplace? It appears that as a nation, we've only just scratched the surface of the potential for teaching English as a foreign language. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schott. You've given us a great deal to think about as we will be called upon as administrators and educators to develop curricula and program models to meet the needs of our students and their families. We certainly want to honor each individual, respecting the language, culture, and heritage they value. In our efforts to provide a fair and equitable education, educators will need to be more collaborative and creative in their curricular design, lesson delivery, and assessment tools. We now invite our audience members to ask questions of our panelists on these issues.
This question is for Sue. Sue, how has the federal government become more involved in curriculum development since No Child Left Behind?
Well, with No Child Left Behind, the federal government is moving into specific content areas. We see this in the provisions that don't deal with the English language learners. In the main part of No Child Left Behind, reading, for example, is dictated in specific detail. And we are likely to see the same thing happen in science and math in the very near future, as well as No Child Left Behind going into the high school level.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Tom. Tom, how do the ACTFL standards make it more useful in developing a curriculum than bilingual standards?
I think the ACTFL standards are more useful in two ways. One is that they provide for multiple points of entry for students who are coming in, say in elementary, junior high, with specific goals and outcomes for language acquisition. The second way is I think that they really are explicit about the different modes of language expression, that is the interpersonal, the interpretive, and presentational modes that I've spoken about, which really emphasize learning and acquiring language and using it in multiple different ways.
Melody, you have a question?
Yes, this question is for Susan. How can parents and members of the community have an impact on curriculum development?
That's a very good question, and I'd like to divide my answer into two parts. First, for parents, I'd like to suggest that parents make a true effort to attend PTO meetings and meetings of the Board of Education in the community that they live in, and also try to get some kind of information from their child's school about what kind of curriculum is being taught, so they know what things their children are supposed to be learning. For community members, I'd like to suggest that they have some familiarity with the community's budget, because certainly the educational needs will affect the budget, and we're going to be asked to spend more money on education, not less. Further, it's really important, I think, when you have large numbers of English language learners, that adequate resources be made available for community needs, for educational needs, and for children who need special support systems.
Clara?
Yes, my question is for John. Based on population growth, how do you see EL programs in the future?
Well, my colleagues and I just recently spoke about this, and one interesting state, if you look at it, is Florida. Florida has over 100,000 limited English proficient students, and that is over 10% of their school-age students. And the projection for Florida in the next 10 years is for this number to increase 100 to 200%. At the same time, Florida has a shortage of teachers, and it isn't really a problem. It isn't only a problem now of the coasts of California and New York and Florida and Texas. It's also become an issue of Middle America. We have Idaho, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Indiana, West Virginia. All these states are projected to have a 200% increase in limited English proficient students in the next 10 years. And unfortunately, there aren't going to be enough teachers of English as a second language to handle this number of students. So what probably is going to happen is that a lot of these students are going to end up in mainstream classrooms, and maybe something will be set up where to get teacher certification, teachers will have to take a course in teaching English as a second language. Again, it would only be scratching the surface, but this possibly is something that could happen in the future.
Thank you for your questions. And thank you for your interest in this much debated and increasingly important field of second language instruction. Our democratic society is dedicated to providing a fair and equitable education for all students. As educators, we must first ask ourselves what this actually means and how this democratic ideal translates into the curriculum we design, the language learning models we implement, the specific lesson objectives we develop, and how we assess student understanding and performance. No Child Left Behind legislation seeks to ensure that all schools are providing for the educational needs of all students, including English language learners, and holds districts accountable for their school's performance. As the numbers of English language learners will certainly continue to rise, educators must hold high expectations for all students and develop curricula using clear, academically rigorous standards of language learning that build around the 5 C's: communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. Communities may need to expand academic and social services for students' families. We trust you have come away with a better understanding of the learning models, curricula, and assessment of second language learners and the forces which inspire the future of second language instruction in our country. Thank you and good evening.